Today we will be learning about colonial life in Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. This was the home of Thomas Jefferson. In colonial families, the father had absolute authority over his family, and wives and children were expected to do as they were told. And everyone, even young children, worked to sustain the family. The husband and father, husbands and wives had to work as a team in order to sustain their families. Ideally and legally, the husband and father was the head of the household with absolute legal rights over his dependents, his wife, children, servants, and slaves. He was often referred to as colonial society in a patriarch, as a biblical term that reminded people of religious authority. A man was to provide for his wife and children's physical well-being, making sure they were fed, clothed, and sheltered. A father's authority. Very little could be decided at home without the consent of the father. Although the father had absolute authority, though he was expected to govern with love and compassion. And for most of the colonial period, husbands and wives were far more equal in terms of household management. The rough life of colonial society, especially on the frontier, was required that husbands and wives work as a team if they were to sustain their families. But the husband was still his wife's superior, and he expected that his kind treatment would be returned with love, devotion, and submissiveness. Society was expected that a man would consult with his wife about the welfare of their family, but if they disagreed, his will prevailed, and 18th century minister Benjamin Wadsworth wrote that wives are part of the house and family and ought to be under a husband's government. Although he governs her, must not treat her as a servant, but as his own flesh. He must love her as himself. But the man was legally the head of this household, and he had to pay for debts of wife and children under the age of 21. If his wife or children committed a crime, he would be liable for any fines, and he had to assure the courts that his dependent would behave better in the future. If a child or wife were a victim of a crime, the patriarch would take the matter of justice of the peace and make sure that that perpetrator was brought to justice. Sons' fathers were responsible for educating their children morally and intellectually. A father, whatever his economic situation was, expected to help his sons find work. If he were a merchant, his sons would work for him, learning business and trade. Most likely the eldest son would inherit the business. Other sons would often start their own business, learn a trade, or work for another brother or another merchant. Small farmers would usually have their sons work on the family land, or send them to work for their neighbors, or to earn money to buy their own land. A father might also arrange for his son to be an apprentice and learn a trade, such as blacksmithing or barrel making. Wealthy families usually divided up their lands among their children, but favored the eldest son. Other sons might be set up in merchant shops or be given financial support to buy their own lands and build their own estates. Perhaps on the frontier. Daughters. Although mothers provided most of their daughters' education, a father was expected to provide financially for his daughters until they married. If he were a poor man, a father would help his daughter find work as a servant or as a hired help with a respectable family. Men of moderate financial means would have their daughters stay at home to help their mother run the household and raise younger brothers and sisters. Some daughters would work in the family business. A wife's duties to her husband. A wife is supposed to be submissive to the will of her husband and be dutiful and faithful. For example, if her husband decided to move the family, she was expected to follow him without question. We have some evidence, particularly from women's diaries and letters, that suggest that women tried to live up to this ideal. While many women had husbands who treated them with kindness, some women poured into their diaries with their woes and grief about a husband who was irresponsible, with money, or physically abusive. Even then, these women tried to be obedient wives, hoping that through love, kindness, and prayer, their husbands would change their ways. If a wife needed to leave an abusive husband, she would have to apply for a legal separation in her petition. She would have to find a community member who would testify that she had done nothing to provoke her husband's wrath, and that she had always tried to be a submissive and obedient wife. Childbirth and motherhood. When a woman married, she began a cycle of childbirth that lasted until she was in her 40s, because colonial women married around the age of 20. They would often have about 7 to 10 children. It was not uncommon for women to have more than 12. Many children didn't survive until their adulthood, though. 1 in 10 infants died before they were a year old, and 4 in 10 children died before they reached the age of 6. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women in colonial America. Sometimes a woman would die due to complications from the birth, or a few weeks afterwards from an infection. A housewife's work. Women's work was crucial to a family's survival. A housewife was responsible for the family garden, not only for planting and tending for it, but for preserving the vegetables and herbs for the winter. This was an elaborate process of either storing vegetables in barrels, layered with sawdust, which would prevent the entire barrel from rotting if something went spoiled, or storing vegetables and fruits in a cellar in the ground. Other vegetables, such as corn, were dried so they could be used in stews in the winter. A woman was also responsible for milking the cows and making butter and cheese. She made soaps and candles, sewed and mended all of the family's clothing. She cooked, cleaned the house, and did laundry without any of our modern technologies. All the tasks were done by hand, so we can only imagine how hard the women had to work. It would have been a luxury for a white family to own a household slave. Most slave-owning families had fewer than 10 slaves, and these men and women primarily worked as farmhands or in the workshop. To help the wife with her work, wealthy families would have hired a servant, usually the daughter of a neighbor or a family member. Eventually, a woman would have several daughters who would help her with her duties. I hope you enjoyed this presentation at Thomas Jefferson's home on colonial life. Thank you for watching.